Um, Two things I thought as we started the month of July. One was that I was going to encourage us to have memory verses because there are so many key verses in John. Today's memory verse would be if we walk in, that's in 1 John, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Christ cleanses us from all sins. But if you look back through what we've covered, there's a lot of really key verses, and that's not a bad way to try to remember passages in the Bible as a key verse from them. But what I thought we'd do instead of asking memory verses this morning is I would like to hear from you some of the things that you remember so far that sets John apart. And where we're going to start today, to give you a hint what I'm looking for, is if you just look at the last week of Jesus' life, quite a difference between the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about the whole last week and the way John talks about it. The others, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't talk a whole lot about vine and branches, do they? Can you think of differences about John so far that you've noticed? I used the word philosophy last week. That John gets into what we would call philosophy now. They didn't talk about it then. But he really wanted the people to understand that Jesus was God. Remember how John 1:1 starts out. That would be, our first memory verse would actually be separated by John 1:1 and then John 1:14. Because if you put those together, even though there's 12 verses in between the two, John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's amazing. But then you go down to verse 14, and he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father. So it makes it, if you have any question after John 1:1, 14 really makes it clear that he's talking about Jesus is the Word, and that Jesus was there in the beginning. It goes into the fact that the world was created by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So John really gives us some essence of who Jesus is and what he records. So often he records that Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one, and he does that continually. John heard Jesus say these things in person. He was an eyewitness. Especially Luke makes it clear the way he writes not only the Gospel of Luke, but when he starts writing about Acts. He says, well, there's others that have written about this. He addresses someone named Theophilus, and I thought it was good if I kind of write this all down. Luke makes it clear that he's not necessarily there for all that he writes about, but he was inspired of the Holy Spirit. And then Luke was with Paul on some of the journeys that he wrote about in Acts. But anything else you can think of that's unusual about John and the way he approaches the things he says? Don't everybody talk at once. It's really interesting, and you can compare between, I'd written down might be on the phone. Did I send that to you in a text, Sherry? How many times John says love compared to the other apostles? They say he is apostle of love because he sure does speak of it a lot, and especially when we get into the epistles. Love, 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 love. So John's a lot more into love than, say, in Luke's case. I like Luke because Luke, nobody in here is too young to not remember Dragnet. Well, Molly is. Dragnet and Joe Friday. Joe Friday was always just a straight face, and he would be talking to some witness, and she would start going into what had happened. He says, just the facts, ma'am. That's kind of who Luke was, just the facts, ma'am. Well, yes, he has the details there. Oh, yeah, something that the others may not notice. And I look at physicians as being kind of factual about things. They, especially now, boy, they base everything on what your blood levels are. Used to, they do blood pressure and temperature and other things more, but now, well, let's see what your blood levels are. You know? But they want to look at the facts of what your blood shows. But Luke was like that. I think you're right about the details. I like Luke. John is the apostle of love, and yet some of the harshest things that are said by John. The apostle of love. It's kind of, you can see in John's writing the fact that Jesus said, I place before you a blessing and a curse. So what I want to concentrate on today and want to make sure that we leave understanding is that John was an eyewitness to the crucifixion. And earlier I appreciated what Steve Moore told us. I've always looked at that triumphant entry, chapter 17 of John, into Jerusalem, and they were saying, they were hollering hosannas, and they were cutting palm branches and throwing them down, and Jesus was not on a big white stallion, was he? I thought, boy, what a common animal for Jesus to ride in on, and Steve gave us good reason, especially with those big palm branches flying down. Most horses, you know, if you had big palm branches flying down, they'd cut and run, wouldn't they? Get spooked. But a donkey's smarter than a horse.
I was just Googling. We're asking what's the difference.
Right.
John was the last apostle to die.
That's right. And where was he when he died? Well, where did he live out his years? They say he actually left Patmos and died maybe in Rome, but he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, and that's where he wrote Revelation. And so really some of the things we'll see today with the fact that he was right there at the death of Jesus, not only that, but when we look at what happened on the very first day of the resurrection, the first Lord's Day we could say, is when Mary Magdalene came and said, the Lord is raised. The gardener said he's, you know, the angels told him that he raised up, and so two of them started running. And said Peter started running. But how did John always refer to himself? In this case, he's saying that other apostle, other disciple. Another disciple started running with him. And then he even goes to the point, he says, and the other disciple outran Peter. So John could say, you know, really, I was more fit than Peter. Or I could run faster than him. But he didn't say that. The other disciple outran Peter. And John was the first to go into the tomb. And he saw the wrappings of Jesus laying there. He saw, Sherry gave me a nice napkin yesterday, and I said, you know, they want to make that clear that it's a separate piece of cloth that covered Jesus' face, and the napkin was laid separately there. It's almost like Jesus bodily raising up. It's almost like he took a hat off, you know, like the covering of his face, and it was laid separate. John sees that first, and then Peter goes in. It's interesting if we want to read how that transpired there. But twice, John cites Zechariah. One was the thing about the donkey. Zechariah 9, verse 9, if you want to make a note, it was prophesied that Jesus would be riding on the foal of an ass, and apparently it was a young donkey that Jesus was riding. And then when we get down to chapter 12, and after Jesus has died and the soldiers stuck him in the side, John cites the prophecy that they'd look on him whom they pierced. And that again is Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. So John 17 is the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And you know the Pharisees already wanted to kill him, but now that everybody's hailing him as a hero, nowadays they'd say, they're treating him like a rock star. That's what we'd say, wouldn't we? That just seems like what people say, but he is really popular, and they really wanted to kill him, and that gave the opportunity to Judas. Apparently 30 pieces of silver was a handsome price, and that was what they offered Judas. When we go from chapter 17 into chapter 18, we're getting into the actual time that Judas, he agreed with the people sent from the high priest. Malchus was the servant of the high priest, the one who lost his ear. Of course, he got it back from Jesus, right? Jesus picked that ear up and put it back on his head. But it was the servants of the high priest that came, and they had swords and torches. It was in the nighttime. I was thinking when Robbie was preaching tonight, the times that Jesus lost a whole night's sleep. And that's certainly one of them, the one before his crucifixion. You may say, well, it didn't matter much. They were going to kill him anyway, how sleepy he was. But it's obvious that he didn't sleep. His apostles kept falling asleep. But there was another time that it's obvious that Jesus did not sleep any. And we've kind of been going back and forth between between saying disciples and saying apostles. But there were disciples that came and followed Jesus when he asked them to come follow. And at one point, he decided that he was going to name 12 apostles. Do y'all remember the night before that? You can see what an important decision, and why when he said, did I not personally choose you, and one of you is the devil, why it really bothered him. And I'm sure Judas was one of the ones Jesus prayed about. Jesus went up to a mountain to pray, and he continued that all night long before he named his apostles. Now, when you figure it's just 12 men, and he's individually praying for them, that's a lot of prayers. And it's interesting that he was praying for Judas. Maybe he already knew that Judas had a little trouble liking money. You know, sometimes we're like this. Maybe if we make him the treasurer and give him something responsible to do for the group, and that can satisfy his liking to count money and everything, but it was too much temptation for him. How do we know? Last week we said there was, wherever the gospel's preached, there's going to be a woman's name that's mentioned. It's not Mother Mary, is it? But it's another Mary. Wherever the gospel's preached, this is going to be told. Not Magdalene. No, see that we talked about 5 Marys last week, and it's really hard to get this straight. Martha's sister. There was, and Lazarus' sister. So Mary, the sister of Martha and the sister of Lazarus, broke the alabaster, and I've always thought of a box, like we said, but apparently it was a sharp-necked cruse, and had to break that off to get the precious ointment out of it, and anointed Jesus, and was weeping, and anointed his feet, and cleaned his feet with her hair.
She's cleaning his feet with her tears.
Right.
That's how much she's crying.
Right.
Besides the oil.
Whatever dust was there, the tears got the dust off, right?
And then she wiped it in her hair.
My mother used to spit on a hanky, right? But she had tears washing Jesus' feet.
Nothing can withstand mother's spit. Everybody knows.
There you go. It can get anything off, right? But Jesus, what an honor to tell people, because there was criticism. And I think criticism not just from Judas. So people say, this is really expensive stuff. This could be given to the poor. And we're going to talk about, when we get to 1 John, we're going to talk about this concern for the poor. Wade, did you have something? But to say that wherever the gospel's preached, that this was going to be told about Mary, the sister of Lazarus, the sister of Martha, as a memorial unto her. I want to talk about another woman when we start talking about the trial. I'm just going to tell you ahead of time not to get off the subject of what happened in the garden, but there was something really special about the presence of Jesus. And I don't know if this woman had actually gotten to see him in any of his teachings or just going through Jerusalem, but Pilate's wife really was concerned about Jesus and didn't want Pilate to have anything to do with doing something bad to this just man. And so she had a fitful night before the trial. She suffered much from a dream, she said. And I've talked with other people about dreams. I wish she was here today, but somebody told me about a dream that in his own life is very meaningful. And understand that when I talk about dreams being very interesting, I'm not talking about anybody having a gift of prophecy. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying that some of us, whether you want to call it a blessing or a curse, have very detailed dreams. And apparently Pilate's wife did. And the detailed dream was about Jesus, and she didn't want Pilate to have anything to do with it. So Pilate is under that influence when we get to reading about in chapter 19. But let's talk about in chapter 18, and I'm talking about Jesus' presence. We know that Judas came up and kissed Jesus, and Jesus said, so this betrayal, in other words, what he told the Pharisees is, I will give you a sign. You'll know who it is. Now, Andrew didn't tell me he would kiss me, and that way I'd know he was ready to start the recording. But there was going to be a sign, you know. And Judas had a sign worked out with him, but it was a kiss. He told the guy that I come up and greet with a kiss. And so to Jesus, that betrayal, Robbie mentioned who is that famous guy, infamous guy, the famous Benedict Arnold. Well, a kiss wasn't involved, but you could get into more detail. And as important as West Point is to us, it was a fort before it was a military school, and it was a very prime place along the Hudson. And he kind of made a deal with the British that I'll get this fort at West Point for you. Big betrayal. Judas was that much of a traitor, but he had the deal worked out, that the one that I kiss. So Jesus simply said to him, are you betraying me with a kiss? Remember, it's dark, there's torches. In other words, I don't think we get the impression that a torch is held up at the time his lips meet Jesus' cheek. A lot of people probably didn't see that kiss, but Jesus felt the kiss, and it says, are you betraying me with this kiss? Now, Jesus said to the group, who do you seek? If I was part of that group coming to arrest Jesus, I would be expecting a struggle. I mean, they've got swords. You know how you're always seeing they struggle, and maybe when you grab his right arm and I'll grab his left arm, and they're ready for that kind of thing, right? So when Jesus says, who do you seek? They told him. And he said, that's me. I am he. What did they do? John 18, verse 6. I'm not the first one to make a big deal about this. I heard a whole sermon about the presence of Jesus. And it's more than just the words that he taught. They fell back, you know, like staggering, I think, like they may have tripped kind of, and I think they went to their knees. They were amazed of the calm statement that the one you're here to arrest is me. It sure wasn't the struggle they expected. And I think, wouldn't you say, Steve, there's a sign of honor there. The only thing I can compare it to is what we've seen in movies. I started getting the movies confused. I was saying it was the robe to somebody. I said, well, it could have been Quo Vadis. There was a lot of those 1950s, 60s movies. There was one where they would show Jesus early in the movie from the back. Might even have been Ben-Hur. But they would kind of show him from the back, and I'm thinking it was Ben-Hur. I'm seeing Charlton Heston where he gives him some water. And whenever you do that, the music goes, dun, 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 dun. Was it Charlton Heston looked up at him and like, wow. I think it was, right? Yeah. The point is, a lot of people try to show that there was a special presence to Jesus. Jesus taught that if you would give a cup of cold water in my name, and certainly that's what was being depicted at the start of that movie, Judah Ben-Hur. He's just a Jew, and the Romans are thrashing him, and he's hot and thirsty. And Jesus gives him water, and it's like, wow, this guy's risking getting beat. He'll give me water, you know. So I don't think that's just all Hollywood, that there was something special other than just the words that he taught. And I use as my example John 18, verse 6. They fell backward to the ground. Now, I promised we'd talk a little bit about Pilate's wife, but it's only because it's what, I'll tell you what let's do before we actually look at John 19. I wanted to read some in the Psalms. Psalms 69. We mentioned Zechariah, but there was also a lot of prophecy in the Psalms. Verse 21. When Jesus was on the cross, one of the things that John records and others do also is that when he was thirsty, one of the things he called out was that he thirsted, and they got a branch of hyssop, they soaked it in vinegar. And verse 21 said, they gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. So there was plenty of testimony there. I mentioned Zechariah with the thing about being pierced, but the other thing that John points out was when that sword pierced his side.
Sometimes we just kind of in passing talk about the disappointments Jesus must have felt. But this here says, reproaches have broken my heart.
Oh yeah.
He was brokenhearted that his appointed ones couldn't stay awake while he was
Oh yeah, they just fell asleep.
arguing.
Fell asleep more than once. When he says, couldn't you wait 1 hour? And then they fell asleep again. While you're there in Psalms, turn back to chapter 34. That was the other one I wanted to look at. The reason that the spear was stuck into Jesus' side is they were coming to break the legs of the other two guys. And that was supposed to hasten the death. Apparently it was a common practice. Just the shock. We talk about the shock involved with a break of a big bone, and that tibia is a very big bone. And to whack that tibia and break it caused enough shock to hasten death. But the psalmist in verse 34, chapter 34, verse 20. He guards all his bones, not one of them is broken. And talking about the afflictions of the righteous. And getting back to Zechariah, we'll go into two different prophecies. One is here about not one bone in the Lord will be broken. So John points out that the scripture might be fulfilled, that not one bone was broken. One thing we might make a mistake when we're doing communion, especially back when we used to have the wafers that we physically break, and we pray and say, so we're breaking this bread like Jesus' broken body. And somebody pointed out, well, but we're not talking about his bones being broken. You know, Jesus' body was sacrificed for us. But with Zechariah, that piercing of the side, it's definitely, if you read the verses around that, Sherry, around Zechariah 12:10, it's obvious that it's a sorrowful thing. There's a time of mourning with this blood and water flowing forth. And then John makes reference to it again in his epistle. We'll be moving to the epistle shortly here. But one of the first things we want to talk about is 1 John 5, verse 6. Here's what I want to say about Pilate. And yesterday I bounced this off of Robbie a little bit, and he thought I was being too easy on Pilate. He really had second thoughts. Part of it started with his wife, I'm sure. But if you look at the 8th verse of chapter 19, it says Pilate was the more afraid. And it was the fact that they were saying that he was king, that he had a kingdom. And it said Pilate was the more afraid. He realized that this wasn't just the average guy that people were wanting crucified. So when you add that he was the more afraid, it indicates that he was already a little bit afraid. And then you look down to verse 12 of John 19, that word sought. Pilate sought the more to set Jesus free. And I did not bring his book. This is the first time I hadn't brought his book, but Guy in Woods makes a big deal about that word sought, says it's the present perfect. Anyway, it's a continuing verb. He was seeking, that whole process of the trial, Pilate was seeking to set Jesus free. And so verse 12 says he sought again. And that's when he's thinking maybe he can release a prisoner. Maybe this could be the prisoner to be released. No, they wanted Barabbas.
The New Revised Standard says, from then on, Pilate tried to release him.
That's the point that the guy in Woods was making. Another place, it was not just the psalm, but if you want to make a note of it, Exodus 12:46. Jesus is the Passover lamb, so Exodus 12:46 sets forth the fact that when you're having this Passover lamb, you can't cut it up and take one part over to somebody else's house. The whole lamb is to be eaten in one home, and not one bone should be broken in the lamb. So there you get the analogy with Jesus being our Passover lamb.
Back to Pilate for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Pilate was seeking a way to release Jesus that he would still be okay politically and look good. He had the authority to do whatever he wanted.
Right, but he didn't want to be criticized to Rome.
He was looking for an out to do it. He didn't have enough man about him to stand up.
Right. Yeah,
You go.
yeah.
Trying to appease.
He wanted to have it good both ways. And here's
I want to make one comment about the bones.
right.
They broke those bones for people who were still living because they had been using their feet to hold them up
So they could breathe.
so they could breathe, and if they were still alive, they would break that bone.
And then you basically you're saying you'd asphyxiate at that point.
Exactly.
All right. Not just the shock. Good point. Right. But it was prophesied that that wasn't necessary with Jesus. And here's where we're going to segue, because we don't have much time. We want to begin the epistles, because like we say in the outline, it's the writings of John. And in the epistles, the first one has the most verses. But we'll skip down to 1 John chapter 5, verse 6. Robbie made reference to 1 John 2:15. Love not the world or the things in the world. So I made that note during the sermon, that 1 John 2:15. But then when you go to 1 John 5, verse 6, we see how this concept of blood and water was really an important concept when he stabbed him and what flowed out. And let's read that together, two verses together. 1 John 5, 6, and 7. Like I said, this one is a New King James Version. This is he who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not only by water, but by water and blood. And it is the Spirit who bears witness, because the Spirit is truth. For there are three that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. These three agree as one. So it's not just the, Linda, to get back to what you were saying about Luke and the medical aspect, some people say that's indicative of a ruptured heart, that in the pericardial sac there's water and blood. If it pierced the pericardial sac, the water's separate from the blood of the heart. You've got that factual thing, but they're making a big deal about Jesus is of the water and the blood. Same kind of thing he talked about Nicodemus, right? He must be born of water and of the Spirit. So there's a lot.
You're talking about the water of Jesus being baptized by John and the blood being from...
I think definitely in the case of Nicodemus it's there, but John is making reference all the way back to when he made more of a big deal about water and blood coming out than the other Gospels. And so that was it was a fulfillment of prophecy, and Jesus had both the water and the blood. It's just recently, I tell you, it was the preacher at Blue Ridge that got me into thinking about that. He was talking about living water and flowing water and that kind of thing, and he started talking about how important the fact that it was water and blood that came out of Jesus' side. So for next week, do study that the way 1 John ends with chapter 5, but there's another couple of things we want to point out that's really important. For one, the most comforting verse in the Bible for us, I think, is 1 John 1 verse 7, where Jesus says, if we walk in the light, or John says about Jesus, walking with Jesus, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Christ cleanses us from all sin. And that's just so comforting. It's certainly not a matter of I'm saved now, and I'm not saved next minute, I'm saved this minute, not the next minute. It's a continual, talk about the continual thing with Pilate, that he continually tried to release Jesus. It's made clear to us that if we continually walk serving him, his blood has us covered. I'm sure everybody's heard the question. You leave here and everything's going great and you worship the Lord and everything's great, but you accidentally run a stop sign. Somebody hits you. I don't know what happened up there at the intersection, but you saw it too, didn't you, Steve? Big wreck. And somebody said, well, if you broke the law and you're killed in a car wreck, you lose your soul. No, that's not the kind of life we live. Is it?
Interesting about the Isle of Patmos, I looked it up.
Okay.
Like my Google lady does. Patmos is situated off the west coast of Turkey, and the continent of Asia is part of the country of Greece. And Patmos is now known internationally as the Jerusalem of the Aegean, or the island of the Apocalypse.
Yeah, you can go there and visit on these cruises. Yeah.
Yeah.
So don't let Patmos give you any idea. It's pretty around there. Thank you very much. It's gone a little over. And next week we're going to start with 1 John chapter 5.